I thought my vanilla suburban life was perfect until I touched her skin, the color of dark chocolate and rebellion. I brought the city's heat into my wife's sterile kitchen, never realizing that a single, quiet post from my perfect spouse could burn a woman's entire life to the ground. Now, I am watching a hero being destroyed, and I am the one who handed over the matches. You will never believe how far a jealous woman can go to save a husband who no longer wants to be saved. Saturday morning in the suburbs tasted of perfect lattes and smelled of freshly mown grass drifting through the open kitchen window. I watched a sunbeam dance on the impeccably white countertop, reflecting off the porcelain cup Alice held in her delicate hands. The silence was so heavy it felt tangible, a velvet shroud draped over our breakfast nook. Every object sat in its designated place, a testament to a life without friction or dust. I found myself counting the rhythmic ticks of the wall clock, each second sounding like a hammer striking a padded cell. My wife was the living embodiment of this neighborhood at 25 years old. Her thin wrists and golden hair, gathered in a careless but expensive bun, projected an image of effortless grace. She offered me that soft, barely perceptible smile of a woman whose greatest concern was the precise shade of curtains for the guest room. To any outsider, we were a vintage advertisement for the American dream, frozen in a state of perpetual, gleaming success. Yet, looking at her, I felt a strange vertigo as if her perfection was a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark lake. I leaned down to kiss her temple, inhaling the familiar scent of vanilla and clean laundry that seemed to emanate from her very pores. It was a comforting smell, the kind that should have anchored me, but today it felt cloying and sweet like rotting fruit. The kitchen air was sterile, filtered and chilled to a precise temperature that denied the existence of the sweltering world outside. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to knock the porcelain cup from her hand just to hear the sound of something shattering. Instead, I grabbed my car keys, the metal cold and sharp against my palm. I told her I was heading to the homeless outreach center downtown to bolster my resume with a few hours of volunteer work. It was a plausible lie, one that fit the narrative of a young, civic-minded professional looking to climb the corporate ladder. Alice nodded, her eyes bright with a pride that felt like a weight around my neck. In reality, I was fleeing from the suffocating tranquility of our three-bedroom sanctuary and the predictable rhythm of our weekends. I needed to see something unpolished, something that didn't smell like lemon furniture polish or expensive laundry detergent. The drive took me through winding roads lined with identical oak trees and manicured lawns that eventually gave way to cracked pavement and sun-baked brick. As the suburban sprawl faded into the industrial heart of the city, the temperature seemed to rise 10 degrees. I rolled down the window, letting the hot, stagnant air of the highway fill the cabin of my German-engineered sedan. The shimmering heat waves rose from the asphalt like ghosts, blurring the horizon where the steel skeletons of warehouses loomed. I felt my pulse quicken as the sanitized world of the suburbs vanished in my rearview mirror. I pulled up to a monolithic gray building in a district where the shadows felt longer and the air tasted of old exhaust. The contrast hit me like a physical blow, a sharp scent of cheap disinfectant and ancient asphalt replacing the sweet floral notes of my home. The facade was scarred with faded graffiti, and the windows were covered in heavy mesh that hummed with the vibration of passing trucks. I stepped out of the air-conditioned bubble of my car, feeling the grit of the city immediately settle on my skin. My expensive leather loafers felt absurdly out of place on the stained concrete. At the entrance, the heavy steel door groaned on its hinges, and I nearly collided with a woman stepping out into the blinding midday sun. Her skin was the deep, rich color of dark chocolate, gleaming with a fine sheen of perspiration that made her look like a statue carved from obsidian. She was 30, perhaps a bit older, with a presence that seemed to command the very air around her. She wore a simple canvas jacket and boots that had seen years of hard use on the front lines of whatever war she was fighting. I froze, caught in the sudden gravity of her proximity, my breath hitching in my chest. She didn't offer the polite, performative smile I was accustomed to receiving from the women in my social circle. Instead, she fixed me with a heavy, direct gaze that felt like she was peeling back the layers of my carefully constructed identity. Her eyes were dark and uncompromising, searching for a substance I wasn't sure I possessed under my ironed shirt and digital credentials. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe as the silence between us stretched, filled only with the distant wail of a siren. She looked at me not as a savior, but as a curious, perhaps unwelcome, interloper in her world. Her eyes dropped to my polished white sneakers, a silent judgment that made my face burn with a sudden, sharp shame. She moved past me without a word, a blur of purposeful motion that left a lingering trail of bitter cocoa butter and wood smoke in her wake. I stood there, paralyzed by a strange and immediate sense of dread that coiled in my stomach like a cold serpent. The rhythmic thud of my heart began to beat against the quiet, orderly pulse of my suburban life, signaling a fracture I could never repair. I turned to watch her walk away, realizing that my world was about to break into 1,000 pieces. Her name was Naya, a sound that felt like a low, resonant chord struck in a room full of glass. At 30 years old, she moved with the heavy grace of someone who had spent her entire life holding up the sky for those beneath her. There was an exhaustion in her shoulders, a weariness etched into the corners of her eyes that spoke of decades spent fighting a battle that never truly ended. She was the coordinator of this project, a woman who existed as a whirlwind of focused energy and sharp commands. Every word she spoke seemed to cut through the bureaucratic steel of the city, carving out a space for the forgotten people who lived in the cracks of the pavement. I stood there with my soft, uncalloused hands and my technical background, feeling like a bright plastic toy dropped into a furnace. My life had been spent in front of glowing monitors and climate-controlled offices where the biggest threat was a server crash or a cold cup of coffee. Here, in the heart of the outreach center, I was a stranger in a land of raw necessity and jagged edges. Naya barely acknowledged my presence at first, treating me with the distant tolerance one might show a stray kitten that wandered into a construction site. I watched her move through the crowded hallway, and I realized that my privilege was a cloak that did not fit the climate of this place. The weeks blurred into a series of late nights where the sun disappeared behind the jagged skyline, leaving us bathed in the artificial glow of the center. One Tuesday evening, after the last of the volunteers had retreated to their quiet homes, I found myself alone with her in the cramped office. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering metallic tang of the city's industrial breath. A single lamp sat on the corner of the desk, its bulb flickering with a dying persistence that cast long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. We were surrounded by mountains of reports and funding applications that seemed to mock our efforts with their sheer volume. Naya leaned back in her creaky wooden chair, the light catching the sharp angle of her jaw and the deep, rich brown of her throat. She began to talk, her voice a low murmur that vibrated in the small space like a cello being played in a hollow room. She spoke of the early years, the protests in the rain where the police lines felt like walls of ice, and the long nights spent writing grants that were usually ignored. She told me about the people the city chose not to see, treating them as nothing more than a statistical error in a grand, heartless equation. I listened, paralyzed by the weight of her history and the raw intensity of her conviction. As she spoke, the image of Alice began to flicker and fade in my mind like a poorly developed photograph. My wife belonged to a world of vanilla lattes and curated gardens, a place where the most difficult struggle was deciding which charity gala to attend. Her reality was a flat, two-dimensional picture in a glossy magazine, beautiful to look at but utterly devoid of any real texture or heat. Naya, however, was a three-dimensional force of nature, her skin smelling of earth and resilience and a strange, spicy oil that made my head spin. I realized then that my life in the suburbs had been a slow suffocation in a room filled with expensive, scentless air. The lamp gave another frantic flicker, and for a split second, the office plunged into a darkness so absolute I could hear the blood rushing through my ears. When the light returned, Naya was looking at me, her expression softened by a fatigue she rarely allowed anyone to see. The shadows danced across her cheekbones, highlighting the intricate topography of her face, a landscape shaped by sun and salt and unyielding will. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that was not just guilt, but a profound yearning to be a part of her world. The silence between us was no longer empty, it was heavy with a million unspoken questions and a heat that did not come from the radiator. We both reached for a stack of spreadsheets at the same moment, our movements uncoordinated in the dim, flickering light. My hand brushed against hers, and the contact felt like a sudden electrical surge that traveled up my arm and settled deep in my chest. Her skin was warm, far warmer than I had expected, and the texture was like fine, sun-warmed silk stretched over iron. I did not pull away, and neither did she, our fingers lingering on the rough edges of the paper for a heartbeat too long. In that small, cramped office, the air suddenly felt as thick and heavy as mercury, making every breath a conscious, difficult effort. This was not the polite, measured interest I was used to, this was a collision of two entirely different physical realities. My world was built on logic, code, and predictable outcomes, while hers was forged in fire, sweat, and the constant threat of collapse. The distance between our hands was only an inch, yet it felt like a chasm that spanned two separate universes. I could see the pulse thrumming in her neck, a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to synchronize with the ticking of the clock on the wall. The tension was a living thing, a coiled spring waiting for the slightest provocation to release its hidden, dangerous energy. Naya let out a long, shuddering breath and slowly closed her eyes, her head tilting back against the hardwood of the chair. In that moment of vulnerability, the mask of the warrior slipped, revealing a woman who was simply, profoundly tired of being strong. The flickering light played over her closed eyelids, and I saw the fine lines of a life lived at a pace I could barely comprehend. I felt a surge of protective instinct that was entirely irrational given that she was 10 times stronger than I would ever be. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumming that seemed to echo in the small, cluttered room. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on her shoulder, my fingers sinking into the rough fabric of her canvas jacket. I could feel the heat of her body radiating through the material, a vibrant, pulsing warmth that made my own skin feel cold by comparison. She did not flinch or move away, she simply remained there, her eyes still closed, accepting the contact as if she had been waiting for it. The strength in her frame was staggering, a raw, primal power that I had never encountered in my sterilized, suburban life. I felt a sense of awe wash over me, a realization that I was touching something far more real than anything I had ever known. I understood in that moment why I had been running from the white countertops and the perfect lawns of my home. I was starving for this messy, complicated, and dangerously honest connection that defied every rule I had been taught to follow. The vanilla scent of my house felt like a memory of a past life, a childhood toy I had finally outgrown. Here, in the dim light of a dying office, I was finally waking up to the jagged reality of the world and the woman who stood at the center of it. The power she possessed was intoxicating, a dark wine that I knew would change the taste of everything else I would ever consume. The building around us seemed to groan, the old floorboards settling into the night while the city outside hummed with a distant, indifferent energy. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the break room and the occasional hiss of steam from the old pipes, sounds that felt like a secret language only we understood. My hand remained on her shoulder, the thumb tracing a small, slow circle against the collar of her jacket. Every sense I possessed was heightened to a point of painful clarity, from the smell of the ink on the papers to the faint sound of her rhythmic, steady breathing. We were suspended in a bubble of time, far removed from the expectations of our lives. Naya opened her eyes then, and the look she gave me was stripped of all its usual defenses, leaving only a raw, burning curiosity. She saw me then, not as the IT volunteer with the soft hands, but as a man who was willing to stare into the abyss with her. The air between us was so charged it felt like it might ignite at any second, a slow-burning fuse that had finally reached its end. I felt a terrifying sense of freedom, the kind that only comes when you realize you are about to do something you can never take back. My fingers tightened slightly on her shoulder, an unspoken promise that I was no longer just an observer in her world. The weight of the sky she had been carrying seemed to shift, moving from her shoulders to the space between us, shared now in the flickering dimness. I knew that by staying here, by touching her this way, I was setting fire to the bridge that led back to my porcelain life in the suburbs. But as I looked at her, at the strength and the weariness and the incredible, dark beauty of her spirit, I did not care about the flames. The shadows on the wall seemed to stretch and merge, echoing the way our lives were becoming inextricably tangled in this industrial wasteland. I was no longer the man who had walked in here a few weeks ago, I was someone new, forged in her shadow. She reached up, her own hand covering mine where it rested on her shoulder, her touch a searing brand that marked me as hers. Her fingers were long and strong, the nails short and practical, and the grip she held was both a question and an answer. The flickering lamp finally gave up its struggle, plunging the office into a deep, velvety darkness that smelled of ancient struggles and new, dangerous desires. I did not need the light to see her anymore, I could feel her presence in every fiber of my being, a magnetic force that was pulling me toward an inevitable, beautiful destruction. The silence was absolute, a heavy curtain falling on the world I used to know. I thought briefly of the drive home, of the winding roads and the identical trees, and how they would feel like a prison after this night. The image of the guest room curtains and the perfect latte foam seemed like artifacts from a dream I had long since forgotten. Naya was the sun, and I was a satellite that had finally broken free of its orbit, spiraling toward a heat that promised to consume me. There was no fear in this realization, only a grim, exhilarating satisfaction that my life had finally found its true rhythm. We sat there in the dark, two people from different worlds, united by the heavy, sweet scent of oil and the promise of a storm. Tomorrow would bring the same reports, the same struggles for funding, and the same cold indifference from the city, but everything had changed. I was no longer a volunteer seeking to fill a gap in a resume. I was a man who had found a reason to fight, and a woman who was worth the battle. The industrial quarter felt like home now, its rough textures and harsh smells more comforting than the sterile halls of my suburban mansion. As we remained there, hand in hand in the velvet gloom, I knew that the peace of my old life was gone forever. I was ready for the chaos, ready for the heat, and ready for whatever version of myself was waiting to be born in the dark. The coldness of the suburban morning would eventually come, but for now, there was only the sound of our breathing and the heat of our proximity. I realized that the luxury I had lived in was merely a distraction from the fundamental truth of human connection, which was meant to be raw and unfiltered. Naya was the catalyst for my awakening, a woman who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to stand her ground. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the series of accidents that had led me to this specific room at this specific hour. In the darkness, I felt her pull me closer, and the last remnants of my old identity vanished into the night air. The secret of our connection began to pulse through my veins like a heavy, viscous melody that refused to be silenced. Every time I returned to the suburbs, I felt like a double agent crossing a border with stolen intelligence hidden beneath my skin. The transition from the raw, industrial air of the city to the filtered, floral atmosphere of my driveway was jarring, almost violent in its artificiality. I would sit in my car for several minutes after parking, letting the hum of the engine die down while I tried to wash the intensity of Naya from my eyes. I was an infiltrator in my own life, carrying the scent of rain and rebellion back to a world that thrived on absolute, unthinking order. Our clandestine meetings took place in the margins of the city, away from the prying eyes of the charitable board members and the local press. We found refuge in the cavernous silence of abandoned warehouses where the dust danced in the moonlight and the air tasted of rusted iron and forgotten labor. These spaces were the only places where our two separate lives could touch without causing a chain reaction of destruction. In the hollowed-out heart of the industrial quarter, the rules of my upbringing did not apply, and the expectations of my wife were nothing more than a distant, flickering ghost. It was here that I learned the true meaning of shadows, finding a strange comfort in the darkness. Sometimes we would retreat to her cramped apartment, a space that felt like a command center for a war that only she was brave enough to fight. The walls were plastered with maps of the city, crisscrossed with red ink that marked the areas where the struggle was most desperate. Protest posters were taped over the fading wallpaper, their bold slogans acting as a constant reminder of the stakes we were playing for. The air in her small kitchen always smelled of strong black tea and the earthy, spicy oil she rubbed into her skin. In that tiny room, the rest of the world felt incredibly small and insignificant compared to the fire burning in her eyes. I would watch her move through that cluttered space, her silhouette backlit by the flickering neon of a sign across the street. She was constantly in motion, organizing files or marking down coordinates on her maps, her mind a whirlwind of strategy and survival. There was a desperate beauty in the way she refused to surrender to the exhaustion that haunted her movements. My life of digital abstractions and clean code felt like a pathetic charade in the face of her physical, grounded reality. I began to crave the friction of her world, wanting to be more than just a visitor in her struggle, even if it meant abandoning everything I had built. One night, the weather broke, and a fierce wind began to howl through the narrow alleys, rattling the thin glass panes of her apartment windows. The tension that had been building between us for months finally reached its zenith, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. Outside, the rain lashed against the brickwork, sounding like 1,000 tiny hammers trying to break into our sanctuary. I looked at Naya, and I saw a reflection of the storm in her own gaze, a wild, untamed energy that demanded a resolution. I felt my resolve crumbling, the last of my suburban defenses washing away in the cold, gray light of the city night. I finally surrendered to the gravity of what we had become, stepping across the invisible line that had kept me safe for 25 years. This was not the polite, measured intimacy I shared with Alice, this was something much darker and more profound. It was a struggle of wills, a mutual recognition of the brokenness we both carried, and a frantic attempt to find meaning in the chaos. Every touch was an act of political defiance, a rejection of the boundaries that were supposed to keep people like us apart. We were creating a new language out of sighs and whispers, a dialect of the desperate that only we could speak or understand. In that small room, as the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, I felt a sense of liberation that was almost terrifying in its scope. I was no longer the IT professional or the golden boy of the neighborhood. I was simply a man being dismantled and rebuilt by the woman before me. The masks we wore for the public were discarded on the floor like useless rags, leaving us exposed and raw in the dim, flickering light. There was no vanity in our union, only a deep, primal necessity that defied the logic of my previous existence. I felt as though I was finally waking up from a long, sterile sleep into a nightmare of my own choosing. The hours passed in a blurred haze of sensory overload, the sound of the rain providing a constant, rhythmic backdrop to our quiet revolution. Each moment was a brick being removed from the wall of my former life, a slow and deliberate demolition of my identity. I felt the weight of her history pressing against mine, the strength of her ancestors and the scars of her battles merging with my own shallow experience. This was a baptism in the dark waters of the city, a transformation that left me shivering and renewed in the early morning light. I knew then that I could never go back to the man I was before I entered this apartment. As the first light of dawn began to bleed through the clouds, I prepared to return to the world of porcelain and vanilla. The drive back was a blur of gray highways and silent trees, my mind still echoing with the sounds of the industrial quarter. I felt like a ghost haunting my own commute, a spectral presence that no longer fit the dimensions of my luxury vehicle. The smell of the city clung to my clothes, a mixture of wet pavement and that spicy, lingering oil that Naya favored. I pulled into my driveway as the sun began to hit the top of our manicured hedges, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. The house was silent when I entered, the air-conditioned atmosphere feeling unnaturally cold against my skin. I moved through the kitchen, my eyes grazing the perfect white surfaces that now seemed like the walls of a mausoleum. Everything was in its place, every object a silent witness to the life I was systematically destroying with every breath. I felt a surge of nausea as I realized the scale of my betrayal, not just of Alice, but of the very foundation of my comfortable reality. I walked toward the stairs, hoping to slip into bed unnoticed, but a movement in the living room caught my eye. Alice was sitting in the darkness of the sofa, her face illuminated by the cold, blue light of her smartphone. She didn't look up at first, her thumb scrolling rhythmically across the screen as if she were reading a long and complicated report. The silence in the room was suffocating, a vacuum that seemed to draw the very air from my lungs. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, the scent of Naya still heavy on my coat and in my hair. I watched the reflection of the screen in my wife's eyes, realizing that the blue light made her look like a porcelain doll carved from ice. She finally looked up, her expression unreadable in the shifting shadows of the room. She didn't scream or throw anything, she simply stared at me with a terrifying, clinical detachment that was far worse than any outburst. In that moment, I saw myself through her eyes, a man who had wandered too far from the path and returned covered in the grime of a world she didn't understand. The contrast between her pristine beauty and my disheveled state was a physical ache that filled the small space between us. I felt the thin thread that had been holding my facade together finally snap with a quiet, final sound. She asked me why I smelled like something that didn't belong in our house, her voice a low, steady whisper that cut through the silence like a razor. It wasn't just a question about a scent, it was a demand for an accounting of my soul. I could have lied, could have manufactured a story about a broken car or an all-night server crisis, but the words died in my throat. The truth was too heavy, too jagged to be shaped into a convenient fiction. I stood there in the dark, my silence becoming a confession that echoed through the empty halls of our perfect, suburban sanctuary. My lack of an answer was the final blow, a quiet admission that the catastrophe had already arrived and was now sitting at our dinner table. I could see the realization dawning behind her eyes, the slow and painful collapse of her own carefully curated dream. The silence stretched between us until it became a living thing, a barrier of ice that would never melt. I had brought the storm home with me, and now the wind was beginning to howl through the rooms of our life. I knew in that instant that the quiet life I had once cherished was gone, replaced by a dark and uncertain future. The morning light crept across the heavy duvet like a cold, skeletal hand, but it was the sound that truly woke me. My phone was vibrating on the bedside table, a relentless, stuttering heartbeat that refused to be ignored. Each pulse was a digital intrusion into the heavy, post-confrontation sleep that had finally claimed me in the early hours of the morning. I reached for the device with a trembling hand, the screen casting a harsh, artificial glow against my tired eyes. It was only 7 in the morning, yet the world was already screaming for my attention in a way that felt predatory and absolute. I squinted at the lock screen, where a literal mountain of notifications had accumulated while I was unconscious. My thumb hovered over the glass, hesitant to break the seal of the silence that still hung in our master bedroom. There were hundreds of mentions, direct messages, and alerts from platforms I rarely used, all converging into a single, chaotic storm. The air in the room was stale, smelling of the expensive lavender spray Alice used to induce sleep, a scent that now felt like a funeral shroud. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and finally swiped the screen to open the abyss. Alice was already downstairs, the distant, rhythmic sound of the espresso machine humming through the floorboards like a well-oiled machine. I could imagine her perfectly, standing in her silk robe, her golden hair brushed into a smooth curtain, her expression as tranquil as a summer pond. She had moved through the house with the silence of a ghost, leaving me to wake up in a world she had quietly set on fire. The domestic sounds of our perfect kitchen felt like a mockery of the digital violence occurring in the palm of my hand. She was the architect of a new reality, one where she remained the victim. I found the source of the chaos almost immediately, pinned to the top of every feed and shared by people we had known since college. Alice had written a post that was a masterpiece of suburban psychological warfare, crafted with the surgical precision of a diamond cutter. There was no screaming, no vulgarity, and most importantly, no mention of the physical infidelity that had occurred in the dark. Instead, she had framed herself as the concerned, heartbroken wife of a naive volunteer who had been led astray by a predatory force. She had turned our private collapse into a public service announcement for the community. The text was terrifyingly clever, using every buzzword designed to trigger the anxieties of our social class. She spoke of her husband's altruism being weaponized against him by a coordinator with a radical agenda and a history of militant activism. Alice painted a picture of a brilliant young professional being psychologically suppressed and manipulated for his resources and his connections. She described Naya not as a lover, but as a puppeteer who used white guilt as a tool to extract labor and funding from the unsuspecting. It was a narrative that played perfectly into the hidden fears of the suburban elite. She had included a photograph, and the sight of it made the blood drain from my face until I felt lightheaded. It was a shot taken through the window of a parked car, grainy and dimly lit, showing me and Naya standing close together in the shadow of the warehouse. In the photo, Naya's hand was on my shoulder, her expression intense as she spoke, while I looked small and vulnerable beside her. Alice had captured the exact moment of our connection and twisted it into evidence of a hostile takeover of my psyche. The image was undeniable, a visual anchor for the lies she had woven around my silence. The post had gone viral within 3 hours of being published, spreading through our professional and social networks like a toxic fog. I watched the numbers climb in real time, the shares reaching into the thousands, each one a nail in the coffin of Naya's reputation. The comments section was a cesspool of righteous indignation, filled with people calling for the center to be investigated and shut down. They spoke of the dangers of radicalization and the need to protect young men from such calculated exploitation. My own friends were commenting, offering their support to Alice for her bravery in speaking out. By 9 in the morning, the corporate fallout had begun with a cold, professional efficiency that was characteristic of our industry. I saw the official statements appearing on my feed, major sponsors distancing themselves from the project with carefully worded press releases. They spoke of their commitment to diversity and community but emphasized that they could not support organizations led by individuals with questionable methods. One by one, the logos of the city's biggest tech firms disappeared from the center's website. The funding that Naya had spent years fighting for was evaporating in a matter of minutes. I tried to call her, my fingers fumbling with the keypad as I paced the length of the bedroom. The call went straight to voicemail, the sound of her recorded voice hitting me with the force of a physical blow. I left a message, my voice cracking as I begged her to talk to me, to let me explain, though I knew there were no words that could fix this. I called again and again, 20 times in a row, until the mechanical voice on the other end felt like a taunt. I realized with a sickening clarity that she had likely turned her phone off to escape the digital lynching Alice had initiated. The silence of the house was suddenly broken by the sound of Alice's footsteps on the stairs, a slow and deliberate climb. She entered the room carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee, her face glowing with the soft, dewy radiance of someone who had slept exceptionally well. She didn't look at the phone in my hand, she simply placed the tray on the nightstand and offered me that same, barely perceptible smile. It was the smile of a winner, a woman who had successfully defended her territory by destroying everything outside of it. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror at the sight of her calm, She asked if I had seen the news, her voice as light and airy as a spring breeze, as if she were talking about a change in the weather. I couldn't speak, my throat constricted by the sheer scale of her cruelty and the quiet way she had executed it. She sat on the edge of the bed, her silk robe rustling, and began to talk about how relieved she was that the truth was finally out. She spoke about our future, about how we could move past this little stumble now that the negative influence had been removed. She was already planning our next vacation as if the world hadn't ended. I looked at the coffee she had brought me, the steam rising in a delicate, swirling pattern that reminded me of the fog in the industrial quarter. The porcelain cup was white and perfect, just like everything else in this house, but I knew the liquid inside would taste like ash. I realized then that Alice didn't care about the truth or about the center, she cared only about the optics of her own life. She had used Naya's race and her activism as weapons because she knew they were the most effective tools for a public execution. My wife was a strategist of the highest order, and I was her captive. The realization settled over me that my presence in Naya's life had been nothing but a slow-acting poison. I had walked into her world with my privilege and my soft hands, thinking I could be a part of something real, but I had only brought destruction. My love, if it could even be called that, had provided the fuel for Alice's fire, giving her the ammunition she needed to annihilate a decade of hard work. I was the bridge that the enemy had used to cross the walls, and now that bridge was burning. Every moment I had spent with Naya was now a weapon used against her. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, where the mailman was making his rounds and a neighbor was walking a dog. The world of the suburbs was continuing its peaceful, orderly rotation, unaware of the lives being shattered just a few miles away. The sun was shining on the manicured lawns, and the shadows of the trees were long and elegant on the pavement. It was a beautiful, tranquil morning in America, and I felt like I was screaming underwater. I was trapped in a paradise built on the ruins of a woman's life, and there was no way out for either of us. I thought of the warehouse, of the flickering lamp and the mountain of reports that would now never be filed. I thought of the people Naya helped, the ones who would arrive at the center to find the doors locked and the funding gone. They were the collateral damage in a war between a suburban wife and an unfaithful husband, a war they never asked to be a part of. The injustice of it was a physical weight on my chest, a pressure that made it difficult to keep my balance. I had participated in the erasure of a community's hope by simply existing in the wrong place. Alice stood up and touched my arm, her fingers cold and possessive, a reminder of the contract I had signed with this life. She told me she was going to call the gardener to discuss the new rose bushes, her mind already moving on to the next domestic project. I watched her leave the room, her movements fluid and graceful, the ultimate victor in a battle of narratives. I looked back at my phone, where the notifications were still pouring in, a digital tide of hate that showed no signs of receding. The screen flickered, reflecting the hollow, ghost-like version of the man I had become in the morning light. I knew that Naya would never talk to me again, and she shouldn't. I was the architect of her ruin, the man who had brought a monster to her door. My love had not been a sanctuary, it had been a homing beacon for a predator who knew exactly where to strike. I sat down on the bed, the expensive mattress yielding beneath my weight, and buried my face in my hands. The scent of vanilla and clean laundry was everywhere, cloying and suffocating, the smell of a victory that felt like a death sentence. In the perfect silence of my home, I finally understood the true cost of my suburban dream. The drive back to the city felt like a descent into a scorched, monochromatic underworld. The morning sun was a white-hot disk in a cloudless sky, baking the dashboard of my car until the leather emitted a sharp, chemical scent. I bypassed the winding roads of our subdivision, leaving behind the safety of the trimmed hedges and the silence of the sprinkler systems. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned the color of bone, a physical manifestation of the panic clawing at my throat. Every mile I traveled away from the suburbs was a mile closer to the wreckage I had helped create. The air changed as I crossed the bridge, the sweet smell of morning dew replaced by the thick, metallic tang of the harbor. The skyscrapers loomed above like indifferent giants, their glass faces reflecting a distorted version of the world below. I saw the first signs of the disaster as I approached the familiar street corner where the shelter once stood. The pavement was littered with discarded flyers and the remnants of a protest that had clearly turned bitter in the dark. I felt a sudden, visceral nausea as I realized the sanctuary I had come to love was now a crime scene in the eyes of the public. When I finally reached the center, the sight was even worse than I had imagined in my frantic morning visions. The heavy steel doors, which had once swung open for anyone in need, were now secured with massive, rusted padlocks. The windows, through which I had once watched the sunset with Naya, were covered with raw plywood boards that looked like scars on the building's face. Bright yellow tape fluttered in the hot wind, a warning to anyone who dared to approach the ghost of our mission. It was a tomb, a silent monument to the speed at which a digital lie can dismantle a decade of physical labor. Groups of activists and reporters were still circling the perimeter like vultures over a fresh kill, their cameras glinting in the harsh light. They moved in hungry clusters, shouting questions at anyone who slowed down and peering through the cracks in the boards for a hint of scandal. I pulled my baseball cap low over my eyes, feeling the heat of their collective gaze even though they didn't know who I was. I felt like a murderer returning to the scene of his crime, disguised as a mourner. The noise of their chatter was a chaotic hum that made it difficult to think or even to breathe. I bypassed the main entrance, slipping through a narrow gap in the chain-link fence that led to the gravel lot in the back. The shadows here were long and jagged, providing a temporary respite from the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. I saw her car immediately, an old, battered sedan that looked like it had survived 1,000 battles before this final defeat. The trunk was open, and the rear seat was piled high with cardboard boxes and loose folders that fluttered in the breeze. The air in the alley smelled of wet cardboard and the exhaust of a neighboring factory, a heavy, suffocating scent. Naya was there, standing by the trunk with a stack of files in her arms, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look up when I approached, but I saw her shoulders stiffen, a subtle shift in her posture that told me she knew exactly who was standing in her shadow. Her face was set in an expression that was utterly impenetrable, a mask of dark, polished wood that revealed nothing of the storm inside. She looked older than 30 today, the fatigue of the last few hours having etched deeper lines around her mouth and eyes. I stopped a few feet away, afraid that my very breath might shatter her. I called her name, my voice sounding thin and pathetic against the backdrop of the city's indifferent roar. She ignored me at first, carefully sliding the files into a box and taping it shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet alley. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching under my expensive shoes, a sound that felt like a betrayal in itself. I began to speak, the words spilling out of me in a frantic, uncoordinated rush of apologies and desperate solutions. I told her I would go to the press, that I would write a full confession and tell the world exactly what had happened between us. I promised her that I would admit to the affair, that I would expose my wife's lies and clear Naya's name of any suspicion of manipulation. I told her I would use my own resources to fund the project, that I would find new sponsors and fight every legal battle until the doors were open again. I was willing to destroy my own reputation, to burn my marriage to the ground, and to become a pariah in my own community if it meant saving her work. I reached out to touch her arm, wanting to anchor her to my promises, but she stepped back with a sharp, fluid motion that froze me in place. She looked at me then, and the intensity in her eyes was enough to make me stagger as if she had struck me. There was no anger there, no fiery indignation or tearful resentment, there was only a profound, freezing coldness that was far more terrifying. Her gaze moved from my face to my clothes and back again, seeing me for the first time as a complete outsider. She looked at me the way one might look at a dangerous chemical spill, with a mixture of caution and absolute disgust. The silence between us stretched until it felt like a physical barrier that I could never hope to cross. Naya finally spoke, her voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very earth beneath our feet. She told me that if I spoke to the press, if I made my grand confession, it would only be another act of supreme narcissism. She said that my truth would become the only story the world cared about, turning her life and her struggle into a mere backdrop for my personal drama. I would be the protagonist of the scandal, the white man seeking redemption, while she would remain a prop in my narrative. Her refusal was a total rejection of my help and my very presence. She explained that she had spent 10 years building a sanctuary that was meant to be a fortress against the world I represented. She had created a space where people who looked like her could feel safe from the whims and the poisons of the suburban elite. And yet, she had allowed me in, thinking I was different, only to realize that I carried the infection of my world within me. My presence had brought the very chaos she had fought so hard to keep at bay, and my attempt to fix it would only spread the venom further. I was a carrier of a social plague she could no longer afford to ignore. The betrayal, she said, was not about the secret nights or the broken vows I had made to a wife I didn't love. The real betrayal was my belief that I could step into her world without consequences, as if my privilege was a shield that would protect us both. I had treated her sanctuary like a playground for my own emotional awakening, never considering that my shadows would eventually follow me across the threshold. I had brought the monster to her door, and now that the house was burning, I was offering to throw more fuel on the flames in the name of honesty. Her words cut through my ego with a surgical precision. She told me to look at the boarded windows and the padlocks, reminding me that these were the direct results of my presence in her life. Dozens of people who had nowhere else to go were now back on the street because I wanted to feel something real for a change. My search for authenticity had resulted in the destruction of the only authentic thing I had ever touched. She said she would not participate in the circus of my public redemption, and she would not allow her name to be dragged through the dirt of a media trial just to satisfy my conscience. Naya turned back to her car, picking up the last box of documents with a strength that seemed to defy the exhaustion in her eyes. She placed it in the back seat and slammed the door with a finality that signaled the end of our conversation and the end of our history. She didn't ask for money, she didn't ask for an apology, and she didn't even ask me to leave. She simply acted as if I were already gone, a ghost that had ceased to haunt her life the moment she decided to walk away. I stood there, my hands hanging uselessly at my sides, feeling the weight of my own worthlessness. She got into the driver's seat and started the engine, the old machine coughing and sputtering before settling into a rhythmic, metallic growl. I watched her through the dusty windshield, hoping for one last glance, one final moment of recognition that would tell me I hadn't imagined everything we shared. But she kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her hands steady on the steering wheel as she shifted into gear. She didn't look at the center, she didn't look at the reporters at the corner, and she certainly didn't look at me. She was a woman moving toward a future that had no room for my mistakes. As the car pulled out of the alley and disappeared into the midday traffic, I was left standing in the center of the empty gravel lot. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around my ankles and carrying the scent of the city's indifference. I looked down and saw a few sheets of paper that had escaped from one of her boxes, blowing across the ground like autumn leaves. I chased after them, desperate to hold on to some fragment of her work, but the wind was too fast. I watched as the reports we had labored over together were swept into a nearby storm drain, vanishing into the dark. The silence of the alley was now absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled shouts of the reporters who were still waiting for a story that would never come. I looked at the boarded-up building, realizing that the light would never return to those rooms, and the hope that had lived there was officially dead. 10 years of activism, of fighting for the marginalized, and of building a community had been erased by a single viral post and my own inability to stay away. I was the architect of this void, the man who had traded a woman's life's work for a few weeks of stolen heat. I walked back to my car, my feet feeling heavy as if I were wading through deep water. The luxury of the interior, the climate control, and the silence of the engine felt like a prison cell that I had constructed for myself. I drove away from the industrial quarter, leaving the gray buildings and the boarded windows behind, but I knew I could never truly escape the memory of that alley. I was returning to a life of porcelain and lattes, but the taste of it would be forever tainted by the knowledge of what I had destroyed. I was a man who had finally seen the truth, only to find that it was a mirror of my own cowardice. The drive back to the suburbs was a slow, agonizing journey through a landscape that now felt alien and hostile. I saw the people on the street, the ones who would have been at the center today, and I had to look away from their faces. They were the victims of a war they didn't know they were fighting, collateral damage in a domestic dispute that had spiraled out of control. One bitter woman and one cowardly man had conspired to steal their future, and the world would continue to turn as if nothing had happened. The injustice of it was a cold, hard knot in my chest that refused to dissolve. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden, deceptive light over the neighborhood. The hedges were perfect, the lawn was green, and the house stood as a testament to the success I had always been told to pursue. I sat in the car for a long time, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine, feeling like a stranger who had lost the map to his own home. I had gone out looking for a way to matter, and I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, but not in the way I had intended. I was the man who had broken everything he touched. 1 month had drifted by since the steel doors of the shelter were locked for the final time, leaving the brick building to settle into the dust of the industrial quarter. The suburban sun felt warmer now, a golden, heavy light that bathed our backyard in a deceptive, honeyed glow as if the world were trying to apologize for the chaos. I sat in a cedar Adirondack chair, the wood smooth and cool beneath my palms, watching the blue smoke from the grill rise toward the cloudless sky in lazy, swirling patterns. It was a Saturday, identical to the one where this story began, yet the internal geography of my life had been rearranged into a shape that felt both familiar and utterly alien. The air around the patio tasted of expensive charcoal and marinated steak, a heavy, domestic scent that seemed to anchor me to the earth with the weight of unearned comfort. Neighbors were gathered in small, murmuring clusters, their voices rising in a gentle, melodic tide of laughter and polite conversation that never touched on anything truly difficult. The sound of ice clinking in crystal glasses was a sharp, rhythmic punctuation to the afternoon, sounding like small bells ringing for the funeral of my conscience. I watched the way the sunlight caught the condensation on the pitchers of iced tea, making them glitter like polished gems against the white linen of the tables. Alice was the undisputed center of the gathering, moving through the crowd with the graceful ease of a queen who had successfully defended her kingdom from a foreign invasion. She wore a pale yellow sundress that seemed to repel even the slightest speck of dust or charcoal soot, her golden hair caught in a simple, elegant clip. Her face was radiant, glowing with a new, quiet authority that had not been there before the scandal broke and the digital fires were lit. People leaned in when she spoke, their expressions a mixture of admiration and somber respect for the woman who had the courage to save her husband. She accepted their condolences and their praise with a humble, practiced tilt of her head, never once mentioning the details of what she had done to achieve this peace. To our friends and the members of the country club, she was a hero who had navigated the murky waters of radicalism to bring her men home to safety. They saw her as a pillar of strength, a lighthouse in a storm of manipulation and political aggression that had briefly threatened to swallow our perfect life. I watched her from across the lawn, and I realized that I had never truly understood the depths of her resolve or the terrifying efficiency of her love. My neighbors approached me one by one, their touches on my shoulder lingering just a second too long, as if they were checking for bruises or hidden scars. They spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones about how glad they were to see me back on my feet and away from the toxic environment in the city. To them, I was a victim who had wised up just in time, a good man who had been momentarily blinded by a misguided sense of social duty and a predatory coordinator. They offered me drinks and jokes about the stock market, welcoming me back into the fold of the privileged and the protected with open, uncritical arms. The silence that followed their questions was always filled with the rhythmic sound of a nearby sprinkler, a soft, mechanical hiss that seemed to wash away the memories of the industrial quarter. I felt like a man who had been exonerated of a crime I actually committed, receiving the mercy of a community that didn't care about the truth as long as the facade remained intact. My IT career was flourishing again, with new contracts appearing on my desk as if by magic, the professional world rewarding my return to the status quo. I was 25 years old, and my life was more stable and prosperous than it had ever been. I took a bite of a thick, juicy burger, the toasted bun soft and sweet against my tongue, the flavor of the grilled meat perfectly seasoned and rich. The physical pleasure of the food was undeniable, a sensory delight that made my stomach churn with a mixture of satisfaction and profound, silent self-loathing. I chewed slowly, listening to the laughter of a man named Bill from 2 houses down, who was telling a story about his latest golf tournament. Everything was so easy here, so effortless and clean, that the existence of the shelter and the woman who ran it felt like a dream I had once had during a fever. But in the quiet moments between the bursts of laughter, I could still see Naya's face, an indelible image burned into the back of my eyelids. I thought of her standing in that gravel lot, packing the remnants of 10 years of struggle into a car that barely ran, her reputation shattered into a million digital shards. Somewhere on the other side of the city, she was starting from zero in total obscurity, her voice silenced and her project destroyed by a single post on a social media feed. The injustice of it was a cold, hard knot in my chest, a physical presence that refused to be dissolved by the expensive wine in my glass. I realized that no one in this backyard would ever mention her name again, nor would they spare a single thought for the dozens of people who were now back on the street. The shelter was a closed chapter, a minor scandal that had been successfully managed and buried beneath the weight of suburban indifference. The people who had relied on Naya were now nothing more than ghosts, invisible to the eyes of those who sat around this pool and discussed the merits of different brands of lawn mowers. We had erased an entire world of struggle and hope just to maintain the aesthetic of our Saturday afternoon barbecue. I felt a cold, dead emptiness growing inside me, a void that was expanding to fill the space where my soul used to be, yet I continued to smile and nod. Alice came over to me, her hand resting lightly on the small of my back, her touch a searing reminder of the contract I had signed by remaining silent. She leaned in and whispered that she was so proud of how I was handling everything, her voice a soft, vanilla-scented promise of a future filled with more days just like this one. I looked into her blue eyes and saw the absolute certainty of a woman who knew she had won everything she ever wanted. The terrifying truth was that I was actually happy in this comfort, finding a shameful, dark relief in the fact that I no longer had to fight for anything. The stress of the city, the weight of the reports, and the constant friction of Naya's world were gone, replaced by the soft pillows of a life where every need was anticipated. I was a prisoner in a golden cage, but the cage was climate-controlled and the food was excellent, and I lacked the courage to bend the bars. I was enjoying the fruits of a victory that had been achieved through the utter annihilation of a woman I had claimed to love. This was my punishment, I realized as I watched the sun begin to dip below the line of identical oak trees at the edge of the property. I would live out the rest of my days in this beautiful, sterile paradise, surrounded by people who respected me for a virtue I did not possess. I would drink the poison of this injustice with every glass of wine and every bite of steak, savoring the bitterness as if it were the finest vintage. The world would continue to reward my cowardice with prosperity and peace, while the woman who had tried to change the city would be forgotten by everyone but me. I looked at my hands, the fingers soft and uncalloused once more, and I saw the invisible stain of the oil Naya used to wear, a scent that I could still smell if I breathed in deeply enough. The perfume of my wife's vanilla laundry detergent was stronger, however, a cloying sweetness that was slowly drowning out the memory of the industrial quarter. I was a man who had traded his humanity for a perfect lawn and a loyal wife, and the trade was becoming more comfortable with every passing hour. I took another sip of my drink, the cold liquid sliding down my throat like a liquid blade, and I smiled at a joke Bill made. Somewhere across the bridge, the shadows were growing long over the boarded windows of the center, and the wind was blowing trash across the empty parking lot where we had once stood. Naya was likely sitting in a small, hot room, her mind already turning toward the next battle, her spirit unbroken even if her world had been leveled. She was free of me and the toxic influence of my privilege, while I was trapped in the very thing I had once tried to escape. The irony was a jagged stone in my throat, but I swallowed it down, enjoying the familiar taste of my own defeat as the stars began to appear. I was 25, I had a beautiful home, a successful career, and a wife who would do anything to protect our image, and I was utterly, beautifully destroyed. The neighbors began to filter out as the moon rose, their goodbyes filled with warmth and the promise of more gatherings in the weeks to come. Alice and I stood on the porch, waving them off like the perfect couple from a movie poster, our silhouettes framed by the warm glow of the foyer lights. I felt her arm wrap around my waist, pulling me close to her side, a possessive gesture that felt like the closing of a tomb. As we walked back inside the house, the air conditioning clicked on with a soft, expensive hum, instantly chilling the air to a precise, comfortable temperature. I looked at the white countertops and the porcelain cups, everything in its place, every surface reflecting the light of our success. I was home, and I was safe, and I was surrounded by a love that was as ruthless as it was enduring. I realized then that I would spend the rest of my life enjoying this injustice, drinking from the poisoned well of my own comfort, and I would love every single drop of it until the end.